Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, July 20th, 2023, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everyone who negotiates. There's no charge for these great presentations. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And one of my favorite parts of the program every week is when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed in honor of our great speakers to food banks worldwide. Natalie Armstrong-Motin, would you please do the honors?
Jeff, I love doing the honors on this program. So today, according to my magic book here, we have been told about $417,358.57 worth of contributions made by our great speakers and our fabulous audience.
Thank you. That's just incredible. Thanks so much to our generous audiences, our great speakers. Natalie, thanks so much to you for founding this wonderful program 3.5 years ago. We're going to be adding to that total today. I know people will be very motivated to contribute in honor of a terrific presentation by Harry Chamberlain. Harry is a partner in the Buchalter firm. He's been trial and appellate counsel for Fortune 500 companies, both public and private sector clients in complex litigation for 40 years. He is certified as an appellate specialist by the California State Bar Board of Legal Specialization. He's handled hundreds of appeals across the country, including very significant cases before the California Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit, and many other courts. Before Harry joined Buchalter, he was general counsel of a California-based commercial insurance group and managed the law department for major U.S. liability insurers and financial service companies. In addition to his trial and appellate practice, Harry is often engaged as an expert witness and consultant in cases involving standards and practices of the legal profession and the insurance industry. Harry has also represented his clients in numerous mediations, dozens of mediations over the years, on some of which I have had the pleasure to work with Harry, and I can tell you he's an outstanding lawyer and a fine person. Harry, we're looking forward to your presentation. Please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're able, and then on with the presentation, mediation during appeals. Harry Chamberlain, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me, Jeff and Natalie, and it is terrific what you've done here during and since COVID with your Will Work for Food program. It's just an amazing idea, and it does a lot of good work out here in the communities. My bank, a place I've lived about 37 years, is the Valley Food Bank, and I know firsthand that it does support people in our community who really are in need, and they still are. So much appreciated what you do.
Thank you.
We came up with this topic, you and I, at lunch here a little while ago. So mediating during appeals, when do you mediate? And I thought maybe a little better title might be mediating before, during, and after appeals, because you can certainly mediate at any time, as you've taught me over the years. And both as a client and as a lawyer, I've known that from the start, that there's never a bad time to mediate. There are opportunities that come up along the way. And certainly the appellate process, as the appellate courts well know, presents one of them. Because when you're off and running on an appeal, like other events and happenings during a litigation, something has happened in the case of significance. We wouldn't have an appeal unless that had occurred. So there's been a judgment, there's been an order, there's been a dismissal, there's been some event in the lawsuit that makes it probably a good transitional time for people to sit down and rethink what they probably should have thought about before the case went to trial, or that motion, or whatever it is that's being appealed from. There's also opportunity, and also something that you and others have taught me along the way, in terms of looking at the mediation process, and that's risk. Something that I used to do professionally when I worked for and with insurance companies, and that is, somebody's won something when the appeal process is underway. It might be a big judgment or verdict. It might be that dismissal on a summary judgment motion or an anti-SLAPP motion. And so there's a good outcome and a bad outcome, but that outcome presents risk. And if you really want a big verdict, and we've had a couple of those recently, you may have seen some of the trends post-COVID. It looks like people are pent up and frustrated and not happy, not being let out of the house for years, and we're seeing larger and larger verdicts. And I guess we can talk to our jury consultants and our litigation support scientists about what the trigger of that might be. But we're seeing in my practice, not just fairly large verdicts and judgments, we're seeing huge outcomes. We're seeing trip and fall cases that hit for $20 million, for example. And that presents some opportunities for discussion with folks like you, Jeff. Somebody has won as big as they can win.
No, it's on appeals.
Right, on appeals, who has the risk? So if you won as much as you can win, perhaps it's time then to sit down and think about your case and think about what your goals were when the lawsuit began, or when you were sued in the lawsuit. What would be a good outcome? You've now had an opportunity to adjust those thoughts, because some court or some jury has decided to give you a dose of reality about that. And there are a couple of thoughts that I have about that in terms of what you might do. The fact of the matter is, there's not a whole lot of cases that have gotten to the appellate process through a trial, through a complete litigation, statistically speaking. I think Rand did a study on major metropolitan areas. This is probably 20 years ago data, but out of 780, 800,000 cases that they surveyed, only about 12,000, so 1.5% of cases end up in a fully litigated trial process. So it's a rare case when it comes to me, and it's already gone through this sausage grinder. And during that process, that means it's very likely that the parties have already had some experience talking to folks like you, talking to their go-to mediators, even talking to a mandatory settlement conference judge without the benefits of a formal mediation process, but at least they're used to talking to each other. And so you have some kind of frame of reference. You have probably prior demands and prior offers, and then of course you have the outcome, whatever it might have been. It's a good time to sit down and talk. The courts look at it that way too, at least some of them do. If we're in federal court, let's say we're in the Ninth Circuit, but the other circuits around the country pretty much have the same kind of process for this. You've begun an appeal, and you have to go through a process, and I shudder when I use these words. The process is called mandatory mediation, which is an oxymoron if I ever heard one. Both in practice as a lawyer and as a client, I never wanted to be compelled to mediate, but you can be. And it's not that onerous. The Ninth Circuit process, for example, you fill out some paperwork and you talk to the mediation conference folks, and they evaluate your case to see if you should be placed on a side track, whether it merits mediation. But what it really comes down to, and there are a few panels of the appellate districts here in California that copycat that a little bit. They make you jump through this hurdle of being evaluated as a case worthy of their time to deal with their professional mediation teams or a sitting justice of their court to mess around with the process of discussing settlement. Like, you really needed to be prompted to do that. It seems to me that in those processes, the key factor in the evaluation is whether or not the parties are declaring some motivation to want to sit down and discuss settlement. So that's something that's in your hands right from the start. It's been in your hands from the start of a lawsuit or any other kind of dispute. You've always had the ability to talk to the other side, to suggest professional mediators who you like, who you respect, and who you think might do a decent job in evaluating your case and getting it to resolution. So you still have these options in your hands. And even if you're in one of these so-called mandatory mediation programs, wherever you might be, in a federal circuit court, in one of the appellate districts in California, you still have the opportunity to raise your hand and say, we think it makes sense, either in the context of your mandatory system or in the context of us just wanting to defer for 60 or 90 days, the expense of briefing, the expense of putting this appeal together. We would like instead to take a month or two and explore mediation and settlement as a possible resolution of this matter. You still have that opportunity. And in the second appellate district here, where I practice primarily in Los Angeles, many of us volunteer our services as volunteer mediators. We'll look at cases and we'll sort of do the upsides, downsides, the pros and cons of who's got the risk and what you might do about it. Even then, in that program, in my experience, if you want to engage a professional mediator, in particular somebody who's handled your case throughout the trial process, they're more than inclined to let you do that. It cuts out some administrative burden on the part of the court. So it provides that opportunity for you. Jeff, you and I have had some appellate mediations recently in that vein. What are your thoughts on that?
Harry, the question that always comes to my mind in these court-related programs is, who is the mediator's client? When you engage a mediator in the private sector, then it's pretty clear that the people who have engaged the mediator are the mediator's clients. But when you have someone who is working for the state or federal government, the question is, who is the mediator's client, and who is the mediator really, to whom does the mediator owe duties of competence and loyalty to whatever degree? And I always get concerned when I hear that you have a mediator who's employed by the state or federal government, who works for the court system, and their goal may be different than your goals as representing the party. The mediator's goal may be just to turf you out of there and lighten the court's docket. So personally, I have a degree of skepticism about people using mediators who are not being paid by the parties who are using them.
Yeah, and we do too. I mean, from the standpoint of somebody who's worked in the private sector, somebody who has been a private lawyer, I do too. I have some general skepticism about government. That's, as a general proposition, but that's a good example of, golly, do you really want to put yourself into a mandatory system? You really don't have a choice, where the real goal is to dump your case. The real goal is to get another case off the court's docket, so that they don't have to go to the trouble of resolving legal disputes. And it is a check the box kind of a thing. And I'm not saying that it can't be productive, because you have some hardworking professional mediators who do work for government agencies. You actually have, in a couple of instances here in California, you have the opportunity to talk to a sitting justice of your court of appeal, somebody who would otherwise have judged your case. But unfortunately, if you happen to find yourself in that position, as we did in a very large medical malpractice case not so long ago, the judge who gets assigned might be the judge you really, really wanted to decide your case. So there are real advantages and disadvantages to going through that kind of a system without the ability to select your neutral. Because preparing the Reagan doctrine comes into play in terms of everything I do as a litigator, and I think it also applies to mediation. Preparing for war is preparing for peace is how that goes. And so you work up your case, you know it inside out, you research the people who were involved, and you have some idea of what possible or even likely outcomes might be. And so, since I'm quoting Ronald Reagan, I might as well quote Antonin Scalia too. And he famously told a group of litigators in the Australia bar many years ago, when asked what the American appellate process was all about, he reflected for a moment and came back with, well, it's kind of like the partisans who come down out of the hills after the battle is over, the lawyers and the judges, and we shoot the wounded. So it is just a continuation of the battle that has gone on before. And the rules, if there are any, that apply to just dispute resolution in general, would seem to me to be valid at this stage of the game too. Something's happened, a battle has been won, or if you're on the losing side, the battle has been lost. And again, you need to understand and know your audience. You need to be prepared to listen to what the other side's needs and desires are. Again, if you're the winner or the loser, you have to understand that there are two sides to a case, and that frankly, just about anything can still happen. You might think it's much more remote, and statistically speaking, when you get to appeal and there's been some kind of an outcome, we pretty much know what the statistical odds are. If it's a case that's been processed through trial by a judge or a jury, they're not large percentages in terms of the outcomes that you might achieve. But then again, you might get a new trial. You might have something that was so incredibly prejudicial or some element of damage that can be attacked on a legal point that you have the opportunity to pare down or shave down a very large verdict. And so that's sort of the world that we live in. But again, back to Justice Scalia, it's a matter of leading with your best arguments, conceding those bad ones, and everybody's got them. You know what they are, your weaker points, because you must. Managing your client expectations at that point in time. Your client may be, bitterly disappointed or frustrated with the legal system, and you're going to have to address all of those concerns, and at the same time address what's going on the other side of the case in an intelligent and a compassionate way. As I was preparing for this, I remembered a program that you and I did years ago. I think it was at Strauss Institute, and it was mediating the litigated case. And we had come up with an article, and I don't take credit for this. This is actually another appellate judge, Sheila Krell-Schoenstein, who had written an article called "Real Lawyers Don't Mediate," and there was a tongue-in-cheek title. We amplified on that. We called it "Real Lawyers Don't Mediate and Other Urban Myths," because we do mediate. The vast majority of cases settle even after a judgment. So we are mediating. And she had a list of do's and don'ts. And the one thing you don't want to do, even in an appellate mediated context, is you don't want to disrespect your opponent, even if you're the winner. In fact, that might be the dumbest thing you can do. You don't want to refuse to listen to what their wants and needs are, even though, you might be on top. You don't want to simply shrug your shoulders and assume either way that you've got the greatest appeal in the world and you're going to win, because as I'm fond of saying, even in a de novo review situation, even in a circumstance where it's an up or down issue about whether the judge was right or wrong on the law, those are still 50-50 balls. You still have to fight for them. Even if you have won a jury trial, if you can show substantial and prejudicial error, you will get some kind of relief from an appellate court, because that's how our system is supposed to work. So those are
Harry,
all.
but if I may,
Sure.
as you said earlier, the chances of reversal, particularly on such things as jury verdicts, the odds are against you.
Yes.
And as a friend of mine who spends a lot of time in Las Vegas has said, the professionals play the percentages and only the amateurs play the averages. And so you may have a case where the percentages say, this is very likely to get affirmed. And yet you may have a client who emotionally is just not there. And this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this with respect to, among other things, the timing of mediations, because even if you've been through a trial, a client still may not be there on the path from denial to anger to acceptance. It calls into question, among other things, courts ordering the timing of mediation, because courts may be very familiar with the legal and factual state of the record, but they, I don't think, are as likely to be familiar with the emotional state of the clients and when they're ready to put it behind them. So could you focus in on those kinds of issues?
Sure. And these client expectations always have to be managed. That's just, that's actually part of being a client. When I was a client, you had to manage my expectations, that's for sure. And then back to, when do you mediate? And when should it be mandatory? And when should some lawyer tell you that it's a good idea to mediate? We had these guidelines in the corporate world where I worked, where we would tell our lawyers at every opportunity, that's before, during, and after a litigation and appeal, whatever it is that you're trying to get to resolution on, let us know what's available. What opportunities are there to sit down with somebody? Who are the mediators that you would recommend? And those lawyers who were consistent about letting us know of those opportunities, they were our go-to lawyers. And we had a name for the lawyers who didn't. We called them our ex-lawyers. So it's important that you keep those things in mind. In terms of client expectations and this whole mandatory mediation process, like mandatory settlement conferences, it's something that you go through as a process, but clearly a court or an employee of a court-sponsored system has one thing in mind, one goal in mind, and that's to weed out as many cases as they possibly can. So you're basically a statistic, and you don't want to be a statistic. You want your client's needs to be addressed by somebody who's professional, who understands that this is a process, who knows how to bring people together. And in terms of the odds, there are times when you beat the odds. And the fact is that when my law firm gets hired after a trial, I'll give you an example of an appeal that I didn't think was going to go so well recently. It followed a jury verdict. It was an enormous verdict. If you looked at it and put it on a scale, it certainly was an outlier. It was way into the small higher digits of the 9900, 110% realm of verdicts for this particular kind of accident or injury. But post-trial motions did not go well. The trial judge, being I guess an advocate or a knowledgeable consumer of this casino, the pros get rich and the amateurs get poor attitude about, well, you shouldn't take your cases to a jury if you don't like these outcomes. the judgment was unchanged. In fact, the judgment was changed in one respect, in that about $2 or $3 million in interest was added. So it became that much worse, and it gave us some work to do. All right. Now, that's one of those examples of you've won as big as you can win on the other side of the case. And if there's anything that might possibly or potentially be a ground to litigate further, that does present some risk. And that interest thing that I just mentioned, there was some question about whether the offer had been made in a proper way, and so whether that interest was going to accrue. On our side of the case, if you have an institutional defendant, we know that in California, interest is going to accrue in that judgment at 10%. It's punitive. It's a lovely return on investment. If you secured a judgment, even today on the federal side of things, you have a fairly decent rate of return. Maybe it's only 3 or 3.5%, but it's a pretty tidy sum. So if you want to continue the fight, it's going to be additional expense for the client. They need to know that. It's going to be the accrual of interest. They need to know that. But from the standpoint of somebody who has a great, big, enormous outlier off the scale kind of a verdict, there are some advantages that can be played. And we were able to negotiate a settlement that was acceptable to everybody, that took those things into account, but we needed some help along the way. So that's a good example of a case that probably needed to be mediated. It's a case where people needed to sit down and look 2 years into the future at what the possible outcomes could be. And one possible outcome is that the great big verdict could be taken away entirely, and you'd have to start from scratch with a new trial. A medium outcome might be that simply the interest part of that great big verdict would be stripped away. It was pretty significant. It was 10 or 15% as an add-on. So that gave us something to talk about. And that was a relatively recent development when we were sitting down to negotiate the settlement. So it was something that was fresh. So that's something in terms of timing that you need to look at as well. Do you let that sit around for 6 months and interest continues to accumulate on interest on the great big, ugly verdict? No, you probably want to get busy and talk about, does the other side want to reap the benefit of what it's achieved so far? Does the other side want to put in 6 to 9 months of its own hard work to look at and examine some of the defects, some of the warts that might exist in that happy outcome for them? Or do you want to sit down and speak to the expectation that your client had going into that trial, now realized, in an extremely happy way, and to cash that in? So back to your casino analogy, we tell clients that that this is a great big casino, that the pros are the ones who do get rich in betting the odds, but worse than that, the only ones who actually make a living doing it are the folks that work in the casino, the croupiers and the dealers, and the folks like you and me. The rest of you should probably get out as quick as you can, or certainly if you've won a hand or two, to pick up your winnings and walk away, because you still risk losing something the longer the process continues.
So Harry, this sounds like the same sorts of things that we discuss with people when we're mediating cases that are pending in trial courts. Money now is better than money later. You eliminate risk of a wildly adverse outcome, an extreme outcome. You get to put it behind you and move on to other things. Are you saying in substance that mediating cases on appeals and mediating cases in trial courts are, when they're pending in trial courts, really not all that different? Or are there some special things that, special tools that mediators and lawyers ought to be using?
Well, I think the simple answer to that, Jeff, is litigation, and the appellate process is only part of that continuum. You know, and we do like to say that, you know, that this is the motto of the appellate lawyer, you know, she who wins last wins. So, but that's not always true. And we know that too. That's overly simplistic. It's also overly simplistic, I think, to say that mediating on appeal is the same as mediating before a trial process is completed or before your summary judgment. And you know, here's sort of the continuum of it. The clever defense lawyers on my side of a case, for example, you know, will look for an opportunity. We'll file the motion for summary judgment, for example. You know, you've got 70 days to respond to it on the other side, but you know, here's our best punch. And wouldn't you like to go down the street and talk to Jeff about it while you're thinking about putting your opposition together? That kind of dynamic works on appeal too. The only difference is some big thing has happened. The case has been dismissed or the big verdict has come in. And that dynamic does change perceptions, because while we're doing this game theory of how things might come out well or come out badly, we now already have a touchstone in the case of something that's happened that's concrete. So, you know, there will be a little bit of "I told you so" in that process. It's still not likely to change those expectations and the client's feelings about what they were entitled to, whatever that might be, and how the system is doing them a disservice along the way. As litigators, as advocates, you know, we're whispering in the client's ear about, you know, you got to be right, or here's your best argument, or this is what we can do for you. You know, we're advocates, and there may be time to take that down, you know, 1,000 feet, and to have somebody inject some reason, some reality into that process about what is still a potential good or bad outcome. Again, cashing in your chips at this stage, or not making matters worse if you're going to continue that process through its logical or illogical conclusion. It helps to have a neutral. It helps to have somebody who really doesn't have a stake in it, and that includes, you know, the public servants who have a stake in simply dumping your case and getting your case out of the way. I'll tell a quick story about that process too. In the Ninth Circuit, we had a very difficult intellectual property case go to trial. After I go to trial, and then there was a trial outcome, there was an appeal. It takes a couple of years to get an argument in the Ninth Circuit, vigorous argument, at the end of which the chief judge, you know, somebody who I've been before several times, kind of scratched his head. He goes, you know, we're going to have to conference this case and whatever. So, but before we do that and we invest that time, we're going to refer you back to the mediation office, and we want you guys to sit down and seriously consider, you know, resolving the case. And it didn't resolve, as you might gather from the fact that parties who were seriously at odds about whether there had been some infringement or some violation of rights on either side, if they were prepared to litigate the case through trial for 3 or 4 years, that's probably a non-starter when somebody decides that you should sit down and mediate the case, even if it's a judge who might ultimately decide your case. So those are just some observations that I would offer. Again, I think it's more meaningful. It's more meaningful for the process. I know, again, this is something that you've told me many times over the years, and I've heard from experienced mediators. It's always best when the settlement process is the client's idea, because that means that they are committed and they're invested in getting to a resolution. And if you don't have that buy-in, you're not going in with the advantage that a professional mediator can provide your side and the other side in getting to an acceptable resolution for everyone.
So Harry, let me ask you this. You talked about a judge who referred you back to a mediation panel, and that, of course, raises different questions about the Article 3 obligation of judges to decide the cases that are presented to them.
Do you think?
Well, it's a question. The other question has to do with evaluation by mediators. Many lawyers say, well, we need a quote unquote strong evaluative mediator to, make them understand. It's usually with the staccato finger. When you're on an appeal, you've already had a pretty definitive evaluation of your case. Either the case has been dismissed, defense has won, or the plaintiff has won, and there's a amount of money that the plaintiff has won. Given that the court system has already done a rather thorough job of evaluating the case for you, is it different on appeal, when cases are on appeal, in terms of the demands that you make of mediators to be quote unquote evaluative?
Yes and no. The yes part of that is it's pretty obvious that some evaluation has been conducted by the process. You've gotten a clear message. It's called a judgment for one side or another. And it narrows, I think, the field of what you might be able to do as a professional mediator, what any professional mediator might do, whether it's part of the court process or the parties have signed you up. I think it narrows those opportunities, but at the same time, I think that those skills that we've been talking about and the professionalism that a dedicated and experienced mediator can bring to that process still come into play. You still have the client expectations to deal with. Business cases, and maybe we go back to this infringement case. After the appeal, which one side won, we ended up doing a business deal. There was really no way with a licensing arrangement. There's really no reason that couldn't have been done before the trial, couldn't have been done during the appeal, and certainly it was done after the appeal. I think it was just one side needed to hear that there was a final outcome before they were ready to make that decision. That's something that a mediator can take into account. And maybe we could have accelerated that process by years if the parties had been in that frame of mind a bit earlier. So looking at these things, if you're going to be a full service lawyer, if you're going to be someone who's giving your client options, not just the litigated, adjudicated outcome as an option, you're looking for those opportunities, and you're looking for ways that will enable the client to come to an understanding that perhaps that's in their best interest after paying all the lawyer fees, after going through the emotional turmoil of years of litigation. What in the overall spectrum of acceptable results, what would be maybe the best or better thing for them to do? Because this is, after all, a process, and mediation, I think, is always a key and important part of getting to that outcome.
So, Harry, are there things that you have seen mediators do that you would recommend as best practices for catalyzing these kinds of emotional reactions from clients and getting them to move from a place where they're rigidly dug into their positions to a place where perhaps they're able to consider other options and perhaps emotionally being ready to make the trade-offs that are almost always necessary to get a case settled?
One of the things that I think the top mediators that I've met, including yourself, bring to the table is the ability to listen. And it's one of the things that lawyers, especially as advocates, do the worst. We sometimes don't listen well to our clients. Again, having been a client, I can empathize with that, because, yeah, there were times when I thought that my legal team wasn't listening to me. And I may have needed, as a client, a dose of reality too, but I also needed to be listened to. And I think that's true certainly of individual plaintiffs who suffered serious injuries, for example, who've lost something or feel like they've been wronged in some way. Just the ability to listen. I've had really big cases with, large money outcomes resolved, I won't say completely favorably, but more favorably than they might have been with I do a lot of First Amendment work and a lot of defamation torts and business torts and that kind of thing. So, partnership disputes and marital fights and occasional celebrity and media cases. And very occasionally, and you've been part of this process in cases that we've worked on together, somebody just after years of litigating like cats and dogs just wanted somebody to hear that they'd been harmed and to have that acknowledgement made in some way. And something as simple as a letter of apology, okay, made all the difference in terms of things that, of things that solve the whole problem. Now, those are rare cases and they don't come up every day. But, if it's a matter of somebody's ability to pay for something, and that comes up too, people think that you sue a celebrity, they have all the money in the world. They ain't necessarily so. And they might not have any insurance coverage either. So those are things that need to be taken into consideration when you're talking about looking for resolutions of cases that mean something to somebody, but in the overall history of the world, probably aren't going to change the planet for global warming or individual rights or things like that. It is one case at a time. We deal with them one case at a time, and you need to be the individual that helps that process, that gets two sides together who are at loggerheads over whether or not something can be worked out without a final outcome in a lawsuit.
Harry, you mentioned apologies, and many lawyers, I would dare say most, are skeptical about apologies and find it difficult to draw the distinction between an apology and an admission of wrongdoing,
Right.
something that can come back to haunt you. Comment on that and how that can be played to everyone's advantage without prejudicing people and still moving people in the right direction.
Right, that's tricky. And as you well know, as many mediators that I've discussed this with and approached this with, particularly in the defamation and privacy rights area, employment harassment is another specter, because you usually have two groups of thought. One thought is, oh my gosh, I did nothing wrong, and the other thought is, I've been terribly and grievously harmed by something that either an employer did or the supervisor of an employer did, that kind of thing. So you have very strong feelings on both sides. And yeah, it's a very delicate balance in terms of what's an apology and what is an admission, and how that might be used. And it's become a little bit more complicated. That's not much, but a tiny bit more. By the Harvey Weinstein bills that have come through the California legislature about how you can't have non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements, and all of that is completely understandable. You have to proceed carefully, and that's really where a professional mediator can be of assistance in terms of defining that, in terms of making this a mutual acknowledgement that folks have had differences of opinion and strong feelings about this. And certainly even putting on paper that somebody feels very strongly, and they get a chance to articulate that and have the other side sign off, simply acknowledging that these charges have been made, and then expressing remorse or regret that this whole problem has arisen. These are areas in which lawyers need to be clever and creative, and often need help along the way with somebody who's had 40 or 50 or 100 of these prior cases and prior experiences, providing some guidance in terms of what might work and what might not work. And I'm thinking about an entertainment case that we handled recently that involved some disputes along the lines of what I'm talking about. And it required a very knowledgeable entertainment media lawyer who served as a mediator, with some knowledge of that industry and some knowledge of that profession, who knew the public relations angles and knew some of the people involved. It was very helpful to get that perspective about what would work and what wouldn't work. And this was something that was likely going to be, at least for one news cycle, published somewhere. And so using the right words, saying the right things, getting to the point of what the party who felt strongly they were harmed and the party who was denying any and all liability wanted to get to, that's a real difficult needle to thread, but it can be something that will resolve a case if you do it in the right way.
And in terms of industry expertise, another topic that sometimes hot in mediation circles is the extent to which subject matter expertise is necessary. And you just alluded to that topic. Let me ask you, how much subject matter expertise, do mediators really have to have, in addition to the subject matter expertise that the attorneys themselves and the clients themselves bring to the table? Any generalizations about places where mediators should not tread?
Not really. I mean, I think areas of expertise where you have a client who works in a technical field or a professional field, and doctors come to mind. I never met a doctor who didn't really know their job and everything that went along with their job. And I'm happy to say that I don't, but sometimes that's not enough. I think that mediators, I met you and your firm when you were in practice along the way as a client. We had some difficult insurance related issues that were going on, and some of your partners were knocking my companies upside the head, and I was writing great big checks to them. So I learned how to respect your abilities and expertise in that area, and to employ them when similar issues of complexity would come up. But like appellate law, the insurance industry is basically about evaluating risk. It's not really being super specialized in handling medical cases the way that doctors do, but you have to insure them and you have to understand how that works. Handling fire claims, you don't have to be an expert about thermodynamics or engineering or how you rebuild homes and that kind of thing. But it helps if somebody has that kind of background and expertise. So mediators who've seen a large number of these kinds of cases and have some familiarity with the subject matter and understand, as lawyers do, how you tap into expert thinking, and that includes client expert thinking, how you help to manage some of those expectations so that you're not just you're not just going into it at an introductory level. You're providing some value added and some perspective to that. It can make a great big difference, but really understanding the process, because every one of those clients, whether it's somebody from the legal profession, from the medical profession, from the insurance industry, an employer, whatever the business or calling might happen to be that the client is involved with. The one thing that they probably don't understand so well is why the process is taking so long, why it's so expensive, why everything is so arbitrary, why people don't understand me. And to have someone who has been through 1,000 of these cases, patiently explaining to them, who is not their advocate, who's not making, you know, a fairly large hourly wage, or, you know, writing a monthly check to be their professional friend, telling them that this is how the process can work. Here's how it's likely to work. Let's get back to what your goals and expectations are. And to help manage that dialogue, it can be everything. It can be very important in getting the client out of that casino. Like I said before, it's very easy if you're sticking to your guns and you're going to be tough and you're going to, you know, you're going to get to the bottom of this as an executive, as a professional, as an employer, as a plaintiff who's been aggrieved by something. You need that perspective, and to have the ability for someone else to come in and to manage both sides of that equation, I think is absolutely key to getting to resolutions. Again, if you can get to them sooner, if you can get to them cheaper, in a satisfactory way, that's really the ultimate goal and the outcome of what we do.
So Harry, we know that appeals can be uncertain. Sometimes the long shot does come in. We know that they take a long time. We know they can be expensive. We know they can be emotionally draining on people. Are there other things that mediators must know about appeals and the appellate process in order to be helpful to lawyers representing clients who are mediating during appeals?
I think that anyone who's been involved in complex litigation for any period of time knows the basics of appellate law. And you put your finger on it earlier, where you said, gee, you know, the pros get rich and the amateurs not so much. So you do know, and you've got access to what outcomes are likely to be after a fully litigated jury trial, for example. But you also know that if an expert witness was excluded, or some important co-defendant was summarily dismissed from a case, or some item of damages is called into question that may or may not be supported by evidence, that might mean something. So those little nuances, which are really the nuances of somebody who's been involved with and paid attention to the litigation process. Who knows who's up to the minute on appellate cases, for example. We do a lot of anti-SLAPP appeals, for example. That's always in the state of flux. You know, I remember when the anti-SLAPP statute was enacted, it was supposed to be sunset. It was a sunset provision. It was going to go out of existence after 5 years because we were going to do away with all those terrible SLAPP cases. And now we have thousands and thousands, and weekly we have dozens of reported decisions about, you know, how the SLAPP process works and things like that. Keeping up to date on that esoterica, keeping just abreast of what's going on in a particular area of products liability law, employment law, whatever the subject matter might be, is helpful to our process. And every top mediator I know keeps up to date on that stuff. And they'll call me up and ask me questions from time to time about, you know, what's going on in the appeal process, or what the hot issues are. The green sheets that my association, defense counsel, publishes quarterly. I know that judges read them. I know that mediators read them, and I get questions about them. So those are important things just to keep in mind if you have one of those hot issue items that's percolating up through the process. And that might be a case that's on its way to the Supreme Court. It might be a case that's either got a majority or minority viewpoint attached to it. And then again, knowing your audience, knowing the court that you're in, knowing where this case might go, and whether that great big outcome, win or lose, might be changed through the appellate process. I think it's important for everybody to know. And it's something that a mediator can hang his or her hat on when you discuss potential outcomes and expectations.
And these are, in so many cases, largely things of which lawyers inform you along the way through briefing and other preparation, right, and even on the day of the mediation. Is that your sense of it?
That is my sense of it. We've had this discussion in the past. How much benefit is it for you to talk to the parties and their counsel in advance, even before you get together in a general session, and to have that kind of preparation, the kind of preparation you would go into with an extensive brief? And I read an article. Let me give a shout out to Laura Cedars, who a couple of years ago for the Advocate magazine for consumer attorneys. Here are the 5 things that you shouldn't do if you want to blow an opportunity to get a large settlement. One of the things you shouldn't do is talk to the mediator and provide the mediator with the information that he or she will need, an extensive trial brief, a summary judgment motion. Provide the mediator with the tools to understand the case and the issues. So don't do that if you don't want to get a large settlement. Don't have a settlement brochure. Don't present your key evidence. Don't present your best arguments. And those are things that we all should be doing. But in addition to that, Jeff, I mean, in terms of supplementing that with a phone call or something, how helpful is that for you?
Well, to know in the advanced preparation, Harry, is critical. To understand what the true issues are, to understand things about the personalities, allows the mediator to plan the mediation day appropriately. That kind of inside information is critical, and having briefs and then follow-up phone calls with the lawyers before the mediation. I find generally the lawyers are not so eager to have their clients participate in those preparatory calls, either just for scheduling purposes, or sometimes lawyers want to tell you things about their client's emotional state or the nature of their relationship with their client. And it can be awkward to have that conversation in the presence of one's client. Sometimes mediators are doing as much work to mediate between a lawyer and that lawyer's own client as much work as the mediator is doing to negotiate between the plaintiff and defense sides because of the expectations issues that you had mentioned, the emotional issues that you had mentioned. Harry, we've got just a couple of minutes left. You've been an executive of significant insurance company. What are a couple of things that mediators need to know about dealing with insurance companies in mediations that might not be obvious to us?
Well, being a few decades removed from that, I mean, maybe I don't have up to the minute knowledge, but I think this is a dynamic that works in most business organizations. That is, there are artificial
In the Mount Royal Towers matter, I need review.
there are artificial obstacles and barriers, and it's good if we can let you know that. Having some understanding of what the corporate expectation might be, ranges, having some feeling for how far a corporate client or an employer, an institution, a public entity might be willing to go. And I think those are important parameters to convey to a mediator in advance, to let you know that, there are going to be upper limits and that kind of thing. And that sometimes happens in a fluid and free-flowing manner during the course of a mediation. Executives who want to clam up and say, gee, I'm not really going to tell the mediator until the absolute last possible moment, what's in my mind or what we're thinking, I think it's a recipe for failure. The same is true in plaintiff cases, and we do some of those as well, in terms of having an expectation. And then you also have that dynamic involved in terms of the lawyer on that side of the case is often a partner, a financial partner with the plaintiff, and that expectation has to be managed too. So there's some complexities to this, but communication at the end of the day is the key. If you have a neutral who can convey this information to, and then discuss at the end of a case what a plausible mediator's proposal might look like on both sides of the case, I think that's very helpful in bringing the parties to a successful conclusion.
Harry, thank you. And that brings this program to a successful conclusion. Thank you very much. The wonderful presentation, Harry Chamberlain of Buchalter firm. We ask you if you're in a position to contribute to a food bank in Harry's honor, please contribute to the Rescue Mission Valley Food Bank. That's valleyfoodbank.org, valleyfoodbank.org/donate/. Harry, we thank you very much. Natalie, thank you. And with that, my friends, we are complete.